Look down. Look at that furry friend, dozing peacefully at your feet. You call him a family member. But 2,000 years ago, the ancestors of this good boy didn't fetch slippers. They were living tanks, designed with one singular purpose: to destroy. In this video, we are going to crack open one of the darkest and most carefully forgotten pages of ancient Roman history. You will learn how imperial engineers turned nature's finest creation into a biological weapon capable of snapping bones single-handedly and striking primal terror into entire legions. We will tell you why dogs were forged into armor that cost more than a human life, and what monstrous experiments were conducted on puppies to burn the pity right out of them. This is not a story about friendship. It is a story about betrayal, about how man and beast were bound not by love, but by blood and steel. Why did Spanish conquistadors pay dogs more than soldiers? How did the Roman death machine break against simple human cunning? And, most importantly, watch until the end to learn the frightening truth. Why this ancient, ferocious killer code hasn't gone anywhere, but still slumbers in your pet's DNA, ready to wake up at any second. Get ready. Your view of dogs is about to change forever. Fog. Thick, sticky fog that feels like you could cut it with a knife. You are standing in formation, shoulder to shoulder with your brothers. A heavy shield is in your hands, your knuckles white from the tension as you grip the hilt of your sword. Around you is the Teutoburg Forest, or the wastelands of Dacia. It doesn't matter. All that matters is what lies ahead, hiding in that milky veil. The enemy. You are waiting for the Romans. You are waiting for the glint of their armor, the whistle of pilums, the crisp rhythm of their march. You are ready to die by steel. But instead, you hear breathing. Heavy, rasping, wet breathing that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The ground beneath your feet begins to vibrate ever so slightly. But it is not the thunder of cavalry hooves. It is something more primal. A sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up and turns your stomach into a knot of ice. It is a low-frequency growl resonating in the chest cavity. A sound biologically programmed to trigger panic in any primate. And you, despite all your bravery, begin to back away. Because your brain, that ancient lizard brain, screams one simple truth. Right now, you aren't going to be defeated. Right now, you are going to be eaten. Stop for a second. Right now. Look down. Maybe a golden retriever or a playful terrier is napping at your feet. He twitches his paw in his sleep, chasing an imaginary rabbit. You feel a surge of affection. You call him a friend, a family member, a fluffy bundle of joy. Now imagine that this bundle weighs 150 or even 170 pounds. Imagine that his muscles are as hard as ship ropes, and his jaws can create enough pressure to shatter the femur of a grown man as easily as you snap a dry twig. Imagine that there is no loyalty in his eyes, no desire for a treat or a scratch behind the ear. There is only a cold, dark void, and a single directive burned into the neurons: destroy. The Romans didn't just love dogs. They turned man's best friend into a biological tank, into a living weapon that knew no pity, knew no fear, and, most terrifyingly, knew no stopping. What we are going to talk about is not a history of zoology. It is a chronicle of a war crime that stretched over centuries, an investigation into how antiquity's greatest civilization took loyalty and reforged it into pure, distilled horror. Let's go back to the battlefield. The first Rome's enemies encountered was not physical contact, but a psychological break. Roman strategists, those cynical architects of war, understood perfectly. A battle is won before the first sword stroke. It is won in the mind. And there is no way to break a barbarian's spirit faster than to unleash a monster from his own nightmares upon him. Historical chronicles often miss this moment, focusing on legion tactics. But imagine the sensory experience of that moment. The smell. It isn't just the smell of unwashed bodies and iron. The wind carries the sharp, musky stench of a kennel, mixed with the scent of raw meat and old blood. This smell is a danger signal in itself. Animals sense a predator. A human, deprived of many instincts by civilization, still reacts to this chemical marker of death. Cortisol levels in the blood spike instantly. Pupils dilate. The heart begins to beat in the rhythm of a hunted animal. Then, the sound. The Romans used battlefield acoustics virtuously. The barking of hundreds of Molossian dogs, amplified by the echo of a canyon or forest, created a wall of sound effect. This wasn't the chaotic yapping of mutts. It was a roar, a deep, guttural bass that wore down the nervous system long before the beasts appeared in the field of view. Military psychologists today would call this psychoacoustic warfare. The goal is simple: to deprive the opponent of the ability to think rationally, to turn an organized formation into a crowd of terrified individuals, each thinking only of saving his own skin. After all, dying by the sword is honorable. It is a warrior's death. But being torn apart by a beast, turning into a piece of meat in a slobbering maw, that is a victim's death. It is humiliating. It is terrifying on a genetic level. And the Romans exploited this fear with mathematical precision. They called it ferocitas, ferocity. But this wasn't the wild, uncontrolled rage of a forest wolf. No, a wolf is cautious. A wolf attacks the weak. A wolf retreats if it senses strength. The Roman Molossian was artificially stripped of the instinct for self-preservation. It was a selective breeding of madness. When the fog finally lifted and the enemy saw what was rushing toward them, it was already too late. It wasn't dogs bursting out of the white haze. Mountains of muscle, encased in chainmail and leather, were breaking through. Black, gray, red spots of death moving with supernatural speed for their size. Did you see their grin? That is not a friend's smile. The jowls are raised, exposing fangs the length of a finger joint. Foam, thick and white, flies from their muzzles like poison. Their eyes are bloodshot, not from rage, but from overload. Their bodies are working at the limit, pumped full of adrenaline before the attack even begins. In that moment, a second before the collision, the final break occurs. The enemy warrior lowers his shield. Not because he is surrendering, but because his body is paralyzed by terror. He looks at the approaching maw and sees not an animal, but the abyss. He understands that you cannot negotiate with this creature. You cannot scare it with a shout. You cannot bribe it. This isn't a duel. It is an execution. And behind these monsters, at a safe distance, stand the legionaries. They aren't laughing. They are checking their ammunition, businesslike and calm. For them, this hell is just a Tuesday. Just a procedure for clearing the territory before the infantry steps in. They look at the work of their tools the same way a modern drone operator looks at a monitor screen, with detached professionalism. But how? How did nature manage to create such a thing? The answer is simple and terrifying. Nature had nothing to do with it. Nature creates balance. Man creates monsters. To get this creature, capable of taking down a horse alone and biting through an arm in a plate armor bracer, required centuries of brutal experiments. This is not a random mutation. It is the result of cold, calculated engineering, where the material was not steel and wood, but living flesh and blood. The Romans weren't looking for the perfect companion. They were looking for the perfect killer. And to understand how deep this rabbit hole of cruelty goes, we need to rewind time. Back to the days when this beast was just clay in the hands of the ruthless sculptors of the empire. We need to look into the place where nightmares are born, into the breeding pits, where the very concept of mercy was excised from the genetic code as carefully as a cancerous tumor is removed. The empire does not wait for favors from nature. The empire takes them by force. To understand the phenomenon of the Roman war dog, one must first discard all modern sentimental ideas about animal husbandry. Forget about dog shows, pedigree books, and proud breeders showing off conformation. In ancient Rome, breeding was a branch of the military industry. Just like forging gladii or manufacturing ballistae, the only difference was the material. Instead of iron and wood, Roman engineers used genetics, flesh, and bone. They didn't raise friends. They were engaged in constructing heavy machinery on a biological basis. The raw material was shepherd dogs from Epirus, a region in northwestern Greece, the homeland of King Pyrrhus himself. The Greeks used these powerful beasts to guard herds from wolves and bears. The Romans looked at them and saw not protectors of sheep. They saw a platform, a base chassis onto which armor could be hung and which could be sent to kill people. The process of transforming a shepherd into a monster began not on the parade ground, but at the moment of conception. It was brutal eugenics, taken to the absolute. Roman sources, such as the works of Columella, read today not as advice for farmers, but as technical documentation for a weapon. There is no love in them. There are only parameters. Two main criteria that determined the fate of every creature sounded in Latin like a sentence: magnitudo and ferocitas, size and ferocity. Everything else, coat color, ear shape, tail, was secondary garbage. If a puppy did not meet the specifications, it was disposed of. Imagine this factory for the production of living death. A damp stone pen, the smell of wet fur and filth. There are 10 puppies in the litter. For a Roman breeder, these are not 10 lives. These are 10 prototypes, 9 of which are likely defective. The selection was conducted with a cold cynicism that makes the blood run cold. Observers looked for anomalies. In a normal world, an anomaly is a disease. In the world of the Roman war dog, kindness was considered an anomaly. If a puppy showed affection, reached out to a human for warmth, whined when left alone, it was a defect, a design flaw, a glitch in the program. Such material was not fit for the legion. It was simply thrown into the Tiber or stoned to death so as not to waste food. The survivor wasn't the prettiest. The survivor was the most vicious. The one who was the first to tear into his brother's throat for a piece of meat. The one who didn't whine in pain when beaten, but growled back. The one whose jaws clamped shut reflexively and didn't unclench until the victim stopped twitching. The Romans cultivated pathology. They artificially selected individuals with hypertrophied aggression and a lowered fear threshold. Generation after generation, they concentrated this murder gene, creating a breed that was biologically incapable of socialization as we understand it. It was no longer a dog. It was a mutant created by man. Magnitudo, size, was also critical. The Romans needed giants. but not flabby slobs. They needed athletes. Selection went down the path of increasing bone density and building muscle mass in the shoulder girdle. Look at the anatomy of a Molossian, a disproportionately wide chest, necessary to knock an infantryman off his feet with a body check. A short, bull-like neck that is almost impossible to break in the melee of battle. And, of course, the skull. A massive, wide skull with developed zygomatic arches to which colossal jaw muscles were attached. It was a head created by nature for crushing bones, which humans made even more terrifying. They selected dogs with a dead hold. This is when the jaws work like a bear trap. Once they slam shut, the mechanism locks. It is impossible to pry them open by force. You can only kill the carrier. Color also mattered, but purely for utilitarian reasons. Columella wrote that a shepherd dog should be white, so the shepherd wouldn't confuse it with a wolf in the dark. But a war dog? A war dog is an instrument of terror. For war, they selected black or dark gray beasts. Why? Imagine a night attack, a black shadow gliding silently in the darkness. The enemy doesn't see it until the very last moment. He cannot aim. He doesn't know where death will come from. The psychological effect of an invisible killer was part of the tactical and technical characteristics of this bioweapon. It was the stealth mode of antiquity. Culling was continuous. Puppies that passed the initial selection were subjected to tests that today would be called sadism. But for the Romans, it was instrument calibration. They were starved to test the limit of their rage. They were frightened with fire to kill the instinctive fear of flames, the main enemy of any animal. Only a few survived. Those very perfect killers. Specimens in which the balance between reason and instinct was shifted toward madness. But this was controlled madness. Still raw. Could you, looking into the eyes of a 3-month-old puppy, see in him not a child, but a blank for the meat grinder? Could you cold-bloodedly snap the neck of one who licked your hand because he was too soft? A Roman legionary could. For him, it was a question of the empire's survival. A weak dog in battle is a breach in defense. It is a dead soldier. Therefore, pity was cut out along with the defective puppies. As a result, by 6 months, the trainer stood before a beast that no longer looked like its ancestors. It was heavier, meaner, and completely alienated from the world. It didn't know play. It knew only competition. Its muscles were full of power, but its mind was a blank sheet, ready for the recording of the most terrible program. The Empire got the hardware, a powerful body and a ferocious temper. The biological machine was assembled. All parts were fitted. The engine roared, demanding fuel. But a machine without a driver is useless and dangerous to its own. Now came the hardest part. It was necessary to take this concentrated wildness and force it to serve order. It was necessary to break the will of a creature born to kill and insert a code of absolute submission into its head. Physical selection was over. Mental vivisection began. And what happened behind the walls of the training camps was far more terrible than simple culling. They didn't kill the body there. They killed the soul to erect an altar of war in its place. You think you know what training is? You imagine a green lawn, a clicker in hand, a treat for the sit command, and a happy wagging tail. Forget it. What the Romans did cannot be called teaching. It was reprogramming. If selection created the hardware, the powerful body and jaws, then now the Empire's engineers had to upload the operating system. And this software was not written in the language of reward. It was written in the language of pain, hunger, and unconditional reflex. A Roman military camp for dogs was a place where nature died, finally, giving way to function. Loyalty wasn't nurtured here. Dependence was forged here. The foundation of everything was hunger. Absolute, stomach-gnawing hunger. Puppies weren't fed just because. A bowl of food is a luxury that must be earned. In nature, a predator eats when it gets lucky. In a Roman camp, a predator ate only when it showed aggression. Do you understand the mechanics? Food was linked in the animal's brain not with satiety, but with violence. Want to live? Attack. The instructors, called mansuari, used effigies stuffed with straw, inside of which they hid raw meat. To get to the desired protein, the young Molossian had to tear the enemy apart. He had to feel the resistance of the material, hear the ripping of fabric, taste victory. Thus, the first and most important pattern was formed. Destruction equals life. But knowing how to bite isn't enough. Any mutt can bite if cornered. Rome's task was more complex, to force the animal to walk into death on command. For this, it was necessary to amputate the instinct of self-preservation. This is perhaps the most terrifying stage of programming. A living being is biologically programmed to avoid pain and danger. Fire, loud sounds, blows, all these are run signals. The Romans broke down this barrier. Puppies were habituated to the cacophony of battle. Around the pens, drums beat for days on end, swords banged against shields, people shouted and created artificial chaos. At first, the animals pressed themselves to the ground, whined, urinated from fear. This is a normal reaction. But they weren't comforted. They were forced to act in this hell. Those who couldn't overcome the panic were culled, disposed of as a faulty module. Only those remained whose psyche was so deformed that the noise of war became a signal to hunt for them. They learned to ignore everything except the voice of their handler. The Mansarius became not a master to the dog, but a deity. The only source of food, the only landmark in chaos, the only one who could grant life or inflict pain. This wasn't friendship. It was Stockholm Syndrome, elevated to the rank of military doctrine. Special attention was paid to the taste of blood. Roman sources shamefully omit the details, but we can reconstruct this process. You can't just force a dog to attack a human. There is a barrier between species. To destroy it, they used prisoners or criminals sentenced to death. This was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. But in this context, it wasn't an execution, but training. Live targets. The Molossian was let off the chain, and he had to not just bark, but attack vulnerable spots. The throat, the groin, the tendons. If the dog hesitated, he was punished. If he tore flesh, he got meat. Thus, time after time, a human was demoted from the crown of creation to the status of prey. In the eyes of this dog, you are not a person. You are just a sack of meat that needs to be opened to get a reward. By a year of such a regime, it was no longer a dog standing before you. It was a biological robot. His eyes expressed no emotions. They scanned the space for threats. His muscles were constantly tense, like a cocked catapult spring. He didn't react to cats, birds, or other dogs. He was interested only in the attack command. He could lie motionless for hours under the scorching sun or pouring rain without making a sound until the Mansuarius pulled the chain. This was absolute discipline based on total suppression of personality. The animal's individuality was erased. Only the function remained. Imagine what it's like to hold such power on a leash. The Manserius knew. One wrong move, 1 second of weakness, and this instrument created for murder could turn against him. But the risk was justified. When the legion lined up before battle, these dogs were more terrifying than any cavalry. They didn't fear death because they had been taught to fear hunger and their master more than enemy spears. They were ready to throw themselves at a wall of shields, into fire, into water. Their psyche had been gutted and sewn back together with the rough threads of Roman pragmatism. But even the maddest, most ferocious beast remains a creature of flesh and blood. His hide, no matter how thick, won't save him from a sharp Gallic sword or a Parthian arrow. Muscles get cut, bones break, arteries open. The Romans spent too much time and resources creating this living weapon to let it perish from the first accidental blow. The product was too expensive to be disposable. The software was installed, the madness calibrated. Now it was necessary to protect the hardware. It was time to turn vulnerable biology into an invulnerable tank. It was time to dress the monster in steel. Flesh is weak. This is an axiom of war. No matter how much rage you pump into a living creature, no matter how much you break its psyche, a sharp piece of iron will always defeat muscle. Roman pragmatism couldn't allow an investment that took years of breeding and months of brutal training to create to be lost due to a single stray arrow. A legionary is protected by a shield. The Molossian had to be protected by his very skin, turned by imperial engineers into an impenetrable shell. We move from biology to technology, from working with neurons to working with metal. If before we saw how the software for this killing machine was created, now we will see how the chassis was mounted on it. Imagine a Roman forge. Heat, soot, the rhythmic ringing of hammers, gladii, pilum tips, elements of lorica segmentata are forged here. But in the corner, on a separate workbench, lies something strange. This is not armor for a human. The proportions are wrong. The neck opening is too wide, strange curves to protect the spine. The blacksmith is working from measurements taken not from a recruit, but from a monster. He is creating armor for a beast. This was the first time in history that a dog was equipped with the same care as an elite guardsman. The Romans understood. Before them was not just an animal, but res militaris, military property. Expensive, difficult to manufacture, and extremely effective. And expensive property needs to be insured. Leather often served as the base of protection, but not just tanned hide. It was thick ox hide, boiled in oil and wax until it became hard plastic. It could withstand a glancing sword blow or a grazing arrow. Blankets were made from it to cover the back and sides, the most vulnerable spots when attacked from above by a horseman or infantryman with a long spear. But for special missions, for breaking through heavy infantry, they used chainmail or scale armor. Imagine the weight. 8, 10, sometimes 12 pounds of iron resting on the dog's shoulders. An animal that hadn't undergone physical conditioning would simply collapse under such weight. But Molossians, these mountains of muscle, wore iron like a second skin. The gleam of metal merged with the gleam of fangs, creating an image worthy of nightmares. But the main element, the crown of this deadly engineering, was the collar. In Roman arsenals, it went by the name Melium. Forget the leather straps with rhinestones you buy for your pets. The Melium was a wide plate of wrought iron protecting the throat. This is vital. In nature, predators, and wolves in particular, attack the neck specifically to open the jugular vein. The Romans closed this off switch. But protection was only half the function. The Melium turned the dog into a weapon even without a bite. On the outside of the collar, long, razor-sharp spikes or curved blades were attached. Do you understand the physics of this device? A dog in a lunge is a projectile weighing nearly 180 pounds, flying at the speed of a sprinter. It doesn't even need to bite. It just needs to slam into the enemy formation with its shoulder or neck. The spikes on the collar ripped open the unprotected legs of barbarians, tore the tendons of horses, inflicted lacerated wounds that, in the conditions of ancient medicine, meant a slow and agonizing death from gangrene. Every movement of the beast's head turned into a sickle strike. This wasn't just protection. It was active armor that turned the animal into a living lawnmower working on flesh. Sometimes they even armored the paws, putting on greaves to protect tendons from being hamstrung. Sometimes containers with burning mixtures were attached to the back, turning the dog into a fire ship, sowing fire and panic in the enemy camp. The visual effect was stunning. When such a beast came out into the light, it looked not like a creation of nature, but like a demon escaped from Vulcan's forge. The fusion of biological power and technological genius. Dirty fur soaked in sweat and the cold, dispassionate gleam of steel. Eyes burning with madness, peering out from under forehead plates. It was already the cyborg of antiquity. Think about the cost. Iron was expensive in those times. A blacksmith's work was expensive. The fact that the Empire spent such resources on equipping dogs says a lot. This wasn't the whim of an eccentric general. It was the cold calculation of a war economy. One such dog in full gear cost as much as a dozen slaves. It was cherished, repaired, oiled before battle. The attitude toward it was strictly functional. This is not a good boy. It is an autonomous combat unit requiring maintenance. Putting on armor changed the dog. The weight of the armor changed the center of gravity, forced it to move differently. Lower, more stable. The sound changed too. The rhythmic clank of metal was added to the growl and heavy breathing. Clang, clang, clang. A funeral knell approaching the enemy line. Imagine you are standing in the first line of a barbarian army. You see shields parting in the Roman ranks opposite, and into the passage formed, they are led out. They don't bark. The armor muffles body sounds. They stand, looking like statues cast from darkness and pain. The mensuarii check the collar fastenings one last time. The click of the carabiner sounds like a gunshot. Now the machine is fully assembled. A body of genetically selected muscles. Software erasing fear and pity. And an outer shell of hardened steel, turning a living creature into an invulnerable tank. Everything is ready. The engineers step back. The strategists raise their hands. Tension hangs in the air, thick as blood. The mechanism is cocked. The spring is compressed to the limit. Now the signal will sound, and the chains will fall to the ground. Now we will see what thousands of defective puppies and hundreds of hours in forges were sacrificed for. Now chaos will begin. The trigger has already been pulled. Click. The dry metallic sound of a carabiner unlatching. That is the last sound of the world as you knew it. Heavy chains holding the demons fall into the dust with a dull thud. That's it. The safety is off. There are no more restraining factors. In this second, the Roman military machine shifts from static to dynamic, and the space between the two armies ceases to be no man's land. It turns into a death zone. Hundreds of black bodies break into a run simultaneously. It isn't a run. It is a low flight over the ground. The first seconds are silence. Dogs don't bark when they go to kill. Barking is a warning. It is communication. And here, communication has ended. Work has begun. Only the heavy stomping of thousands of paws, sounding like hail on a roof, and the rhythmic, asthmatic wheezing of hundreds of throats sucking in air are heard. Imagine yourself on the other side. You are a tribal warrior, proud and strong. You stand in the front row, spear extended. You expected infantry. You knew how to fight a man. A man is predictable. A man has 2 arms, 2 legs, and the fear of death in his eyes. But it isn't a man rushing at you. A biological torpedo weighing 150 pounds is rushing at you. You see the grass being trampled under their pressure. The distance is closing catastrophically fast. 150 feet. 100. 30. You try to aim, but the target is too low, too fast. Glints of sun on their armor blind your eyes. And then, impact. The physics of the collision are terrible. It is pure kinetic energy. Accelerated muscle mass, amplified by the weight of armor, crashes into your shields, not at chest level, but at knee level. This breaks any stance. Bone cannot withstand it. Tendons tear with a sickening, wet sound, resembling the tearing of tightly stretched fabric. The front row of your army doesn't just fall. It topples, crumples like a house of cards in the wind. The formation is broken. And in battle, a broken formation is a death sentence. But the worst begins on the ground. When you fall, you find yourself in their world, at ground level. Fencing rules don't apply here. The mechanics of a meat grinder work here. The Molossian doesn't bite chaotically. He was taught. He works like a hydraulic press. Jaws clamp onto a limb, and a sharp jerk of the head to the side follows. Crunch. This isn't just a fracture. It is the structural destruction of a support. A man deprived of the ability to stand ceases to be a warrior. He becomes a screaming piece of flesh. Absolute chaos reigns all around. The screams of the wounded, the squealing of horses whose bellies have been ripped open by spiked collars, and above all this, the heavy, wet breathing of dogs, working in this bloody fog with the method of butchers in a slaughterhouse. Legionaries called this moment the harvest. The dogs weren't supposed to kill everyone. Their task was tactical, to create a breach, instill panic, turn an organized phalanx into a crowd of terrified loners. And they succeeded brilliantly. While the barbarians tried to fight off the low-slung monsters that slipped under sword swings, the legion was already approaching the melee. The Romans only had to finish off those who had been knocked down, those who were trying to pry open the steel traps of jaws on their arms, those who had forgotten about the battle and thought only of how to save themselves from the beast. It was a scene from the underworld. Imagine the smell. A mixture of churned earth, bowel contents, and fresh blood. Imagine the sound. It is not the ringing of steel on steel. It is slurping, growling, and screams of terror turning into ultrasound. In this pile-up, the dog in armor was almost invulnerable. A glancing sword strike only struck sparks from the collar or slid off the oiled leather blanket. The dog didn't feel pain from bruises. Adrenaline drowned out all nervous system signals. He was in a state of combat trance, executing a single program. Tear, bring down, find the next one. Could you keep your cool seeing your comrade being dragged along the ground by a creature you considered just an animal yesterday? Seeing spikes on its neck ripping open flesh like paper. Panic spread like wildfire. The rear ranks, hearing the screams of the front, began to back away. Flight became a chain reaction. And it wasn't dogs flying into the backs of the fleeing, but the pylums of legionaries. Operation complete. Field cleared. The biological weapon performed its function with an efficiency that modern technology would envy. When the battle died down, the eerie cooling down phase began. The dogs were recalled. The Mansuari whistled, bringing their pets back to reality. The dogs returned slowly, breathing heavily, their muzzles covered in foreign blood up to their ears. Some limped, others had dented or slashed armor. But that same cold fire still burned in their eyes. They felt no guilt. A tool cannot be guilty of working well. The legionaries looked at them with a mixture of respect and disgust. They understood. Today, these beasts saved their lives by taking the first blow. But no one wanted to get too close to them. Even in a calm state, these machines radiated a threat. It seemed this tandem of man and beast, steel and fangs, was invincible. It seemed Rome had found the absolute weapon, the Wunderwaffe of antiquity, against which there was no defense. Legions marched across Europe, and the fame of the monstrous dogs ran ahead of them, breaking the will of enemies before the battle even began. But the history of war teaches us one thing. For every action, there is always a reaction. For any shield, there is a sword. For any armor, an armor-piercing shell. An absolute weapon does not exist. And very soon, Roman strategists had to learn this lesson when their living tanks collided with something they couldn't bite through and couldn't intimidate. The era of dominance was coming to an end, meeting the resistance of elements and human cunning. The myth of invincibility is the most dangerous lie in war. The Romans believed in their creation. They looked at the legions of fangs clad in armor and saw absolute power. But any force has inertia, and any weapon has a limit. The empire's enemies, those very barbarians Rome despised, turned out not to be mindless victims. They were observant. They learned. And very soon they realized, if you can't stop a tank with a frontal blow, you must break its tracks, or set fire to its fuel. The history of the Roman war dog took a sharp turn, crashing into the wall of opponent adaptation. The living death machine, which seemed invulnerable, suddenly malfunctioned. And this malfunction cost the empire rivers of blood. The first alarm bell rang on the misty islands of Britain. The local Celtic tribes didn't run in terror at the sight of Roman Molossians. They had their own answer. The Britons fielded their own dogs against the imperial heavyweights, the Agassi. They were smaller, lighter, but they were faster. Imagine a fight between a heavyweight boxer and a knife-fighting master. The Roman Molossian, encased in iron, was inertial. While he turned his powerful body for a strike, the nimble British dogs were already hanging on his unprotected hind legs, tearing tendons, rolling away. The bulky armor that saved from swords became a trap. It was exhausting. It slowed reaction time. Roman commanders watched with horror as their elite destroyers turned into clumsy targets being hunted by a pack like bears. But a real nightmare awaited the legions in the forests of Germany. The Germans, children of harsh gods, knew more about the nature of the beast than Roman engineers. They knew, no matter what training a dog undergoes, no matter how broken its spirit is, deep in its brain, in its most ancient part, lives a primal fear. Fear of fire.
The Romans could habituate dogs to the noise of battle, to the smell of blood. But the instinct of self-preservation in the face of raging flames is impossible to burn out. The Germans met the attack not with shields. They met it with a wall of fire. Torches flew into dry grass. Stripes of oil poured in advance flared up. Imagine this moment. Hundreds of armored beasts flying into a smokescreen at full speed, and suddenly an orange wall breathing heat rises before them. Biology took precedence over the program. The Molossians, those fearless killers, stopped dead in their tracks. Heat hit their faces, singed their whiskers. The smell of burnt fur instantly overpowered the smell of the enemy. Panic. Animal, uncontrollable panic seized the pack. They began to thrash about, knocking each other over, getting tangled in their own formations. The rear pressed on the front, pushing them into the fire. The howl of rage was replaced by a squeal of pain, and through the smoke and flames flew German javelins, striking the animals huddled in a heap. The doomsday weapon broke, stumbling upon the elements. However, the most cruel and effective lesson was taught to the Romans in the east. The Parthians and Persians didn't rely on chance. They were masters of engineering no less than the Romans. Against living tanks, they used the simplest, cheapest, and absolutely deadly invention: caltrops. Iron garlic. 4 spikes welded so that no matter how you throw this object, one spike always points vertically up. The Parthians sewed the approaches to their positions with them, hiding the iron in tall grass or sand. The attack of the Roman dogs choked in seconds. It was a spectacle from which even seasoned veterans turned away. Imagine, a powerful dog at full speed drives a paw into a steel spike. The point passes through the pad, crushes the small metatarsal bones, and comes out. The pain is instantaneous, blinding. The dog falls, tries to stand on other legs, and immediately runs into new spikes. An armored monster capable of biting through a bull's throat turned out to be helpless before a piece of iron the size of a walnut. The offensive impulse turned into a bloody mess. The battlefield filled not with growls, but with whining. Hundreds of crippled animals crawled on their bellies, gnawing their own paws, trying to tear the metal out of the flesh, going mad with pain. Legionaries saw this, and this sight demoralized them more than any enemy attack. Their gods of war were lying in the dust, whining like beaten puppies. The myth of invulnerability was trampled. Roman strategists realized that their bet on brute biological force was beaten by intellect and cunning. Maintaining such troops became unjustifiably risky. A weapon that can be neutralized by a handful of scattered iron pieces is not worth the gold spent on creating it. Tactical dead end. The terror machine turned out to be a highly specialized tool, effective only against an unprepared enemy. Against professionals, it turned into a burden. Wounded, burned, crippled dogs, which a minute ago were the pride of the Legion, now became a problem. They couldn't walk, they couldn't fight. They required water, food, and care. But war is economics, and in the Roman accounting of death, there is no column for disability pension for 4-legged property. When the smoke cleared and the moans subsided, the commanders looked at this field of sorrow with a cold, appraising gaze. They didn't see suffering living beings, they saw scrap. Broken inventory slowing down the army, and the Empire dealt with useless inventory simply. On the horizon loomed not glory, but disposal. A cruel, pragmatic purge of their own ranks. The battle is over. Dust mixed with the smell of burning settles over the battlefield. The Legion counts losses. Field hospitals, valetudinaria, are deployed for soldiers. Moaning, bloodied men are carried there, where doctors will wash wounds with wine, stitch them up, give poppy decoction. The Empire values its citizens. The Empire takes care of those who hold the shield. But a little further away, on the border of the camp, a completely different procedure is taking place. There are no doctors here. Quartermasters work here. They walk between the rows of animals lying on the ground, those very Molossians that an hour ago threw themselves on Parthian spikes and burned in German fire. The dogs look at the approaching people with hope. They wag their tails, thumping them on the bloodied ground. They wait for help. They believe that the pack contract works both ways. We protected you.
Now you protect us. What a naive animal mistake. Rome doesn't believe in sentimentality. Rome believes in the balance sheet. The man walking along the rows carries no bandages. He has an inventory list and a stylus in his hands. He looks at a dog whose paw was shattered by a caltrop. There is no compassion in his eyes, only cold calculation. He makes a quick calculation in his mind. How much will treatment cost? A wagon for transport will be needed. Enhanced nutrition, meat, which is already in short supply, will be needed for 2 months. The work of a person to change bandages will be needed. And what is the output? A lame beast that has lost its main characteristic, speed. An asset has turned into a liability. And in the Roman army, liabilities are dealt with radically. This is called writing off property, the cruelest bureaucracy of death. The quartermaster makes a mark on a wax tablet and nods to his assistant. The assistant approaches the dog. The dog, smelling the familiar scent of ammunition, tries to get up, to lick the hand. He thinks the master has come to praise him for his service, but the human hand reaches not for the head. It reaches for the buckles of the collar. Click, click. The heavy steel plate with spikes, that very Melium, is removed from the neck. Then the leather blanket, reinforced with rings, is removed. This is the most valuable part. Armor costs money. Armor is undamaged. Armor can be put on the next recruit arriving with the convoy from Epirus. And what is under the armor, living, warm, breathing, is just expendable material. A disposable biological gasket between imperial steel and the enemy's sword. As soon as the last strap is unbuckled, the value of the creature drops to 0. It is no longer a combat unit. It is garbage that needs to be disposed of so as not to waste resources on maintenance and not to provoke unsanitary conditions. A blow. A short, professional, calculated blow with a hammer between the ears or a quick slash of a knife across the throat. Without malice, without hatred. That's how handles of cracked shovels are broken before throwing them into the fire.
The dog doesn't even have time to understand what happened. In its last look freezes not pain, but bewilderment. Betrayal. That is the true name of this procedure. The most faithful creature on the planet receives as a reward for loyalty a place in a mass grave, where corpses of horses and broken carts are dumped. By the 3rd century AD, enthusiasm for war dogs began to fade. Roman strategists, those logistics geniuses, calculated the debit and credit. Maintaining a regiment of Molossians cost the treasury colossal sums. They ate as much as grown men, but their tactical flexibility was limited. They couldn't build fortifications, couldn't shoot arrows, couldn't hold a formation in defense. They were a one-hit weapon. And when that hit ceased to be guaranteed lethal due to enemy adaptation, the project's profitability collapsed. The empire, like a giant corporation, began closing inefficient branches. The living tank program was winding down. But where to put thousands of specially bred killers? They can't just be sent home like veteran legionaries, given a plot of land. These are beasts programmed for aggression. They are dangerous. And again, the mechanism of cold pragmatism kicked in. Mass culling. In the last years of active use of Molossians, legions left behind not only burned enemy villages, but also burial grounds of their own dogs. They were slaughtered by the hundreds before long marches, so as not to drag extra cargo. It was a cynical genocide of a breed created by human hands. Legionaries, many of whom had managed to get attached to their ferocious partners, silently carried out the order. Discipline is above feelings. An order is an order. Property written off. However, it was impossible to kill everyone. The Roman Molossian was too resilient.
too powerful a creation to simply disappear into oblivion at the stroke of an official's pen. Some dogs survived. Some ran away in the chaos of retreat, went feral and formed packs, terrorizing the surroundings of former camps. Some were secretly sold by legionaries, violating regulations, to locals, or taken with them as trophies when retiring. The great army was falling apart, and with it, the monopoly on violence was falling apart. The genetic code created for war began to leak beyond the perimeter of military bases. Ferocitas, ferocity forged in the forges of Mars, was no longer under state control. It spilled out into the world looking for a new master. And, of course, it found one. Because if the empire fell, the thirst for blood and spectacles in the human race remained unchanged. The history of the war dog didn't end. It just changed genre, from military tragedy to blood sport. The legacy of the legions was preparing to enter a new, even dirtier arena. The empire fell. Columns collapsed, aqueducts dried up, Forum marble was dragged away to build pigsties. Great Rome, which seemed eternal, crumbled to dust under the blows of those very barbarians it had tried to destroy for centuries. But biology turned out to be stronger than stone. States die, genes remain. That terrible ferocitas code, bred in secret legion nurseries, didn't go anywhere. It was just orphaned. And like any abandoned weapon, it immediately found new hands. The dirty, greedy, cruel hands of the Middle Ages. The story of the noble, albeit monstrous, soldier ended. The story of the chain dog and gladiator began. Imagine a map of Europe plunging into the darkness of the Dark Ages. Descendants of Roman Molossians spread across this map like ink stains. The legions left, but they left their beasts behind. In the German town of Rottweil, a former Roman outpost, these shards of the empire found a new calling. They no longer stormed enemy lines, they became butcher's tools. They were called Metzgerhund. Imagine this degradation. A creature created to battle kings now guards a cart with carcasses and drives bulls to slaughter. Butchers, pragmatic people, quickly realized the value of Roman breeding. They hung purses with proceeds right on the dogs' necks. No thief in his right mind would risk sticking his hand near the throat of a beast in whose eyes the memory of hundreds of torn throats could be read. A living safe. A biological lock, the key to which is only death. But this was only the beginning of the fall. In damp stone castles of feudal lords, descendants of Molossians were put on a short chain. Iron once again shackled their necks, but now it wasn't combat armor, but a symbol of slavery. Their task was not to win, but to scare. Huge mastiffs, direct heirs of Roman killers, lay at the gates, wheezing with malice at every passerby. Their world narrowed to the radius of a chain. The psyche, already shattered by centuries of breeding for aggression, broke completely in conditions of isolation. A dog deprived of work, deprived of movement, turned into a clot of pure, concentrated hatred. This was no longer a calculating warrior. This was a psychopath throwing himself at his own shadow. And then man got bored. Wars subsided, but the thirst for blood demanded an outlet, and the Roman product was dragged out for the amusement of the crowd. Rome's gladiatorial arenas were reborn in the form of dirty pits in market squares of England and France. Baiting, that's the new name for old cruelty. A stake was driven into the center of the pen. A bear or bull was tied to it, and the dogs were released. Those same ones whose ancestors took down legionaries, now they had to die to the hooting of drunken peasants and the gambling shouts of the nobility. Have you ever seen engravings depicting bull baiting? Look closely at them. Dogs hanging on the nose of a giant animal. This isn't hunting. In nature, a predator kills quickly and efficiently. Here, the goal was a show, to prolong the suffering. Roman selection for the dead hold came in handy. Spectators placed bets. How many minutes would the dog last before the bull tossed it on its horns and threw it into the crowd like a rag doll? Would they hear the crunch of the spine? Would they see guts? The crowd craved spectacles, and the descendants of Molossians paid for this gambling with their lives. A special caste of dogs appeared, old-type bulldogs, direct great-grandchildren of Roman war machines. Their muzzles became even shorter so they could breathe without unclamping jaws sunk into the victim's flesh. Their pain threshold dropped to 0. You could chop off such a dog's paw right during the fight, and it wouldn't unclench its teeth. This was considered valor. True spirit, the gamblers whispered admiringly, counting profits. In reality, it was the deepest pathology. We took loyalty and turned it into suicidal stubbornness. We taught the dog to ignore the instinct of self-preservation for our entertainment. In these pits, soaked in the smell of urine, cheap ale, and fear, that very image of the killer dog that scares us to this day was finally formed. The Romans used them as a weapon, but respected them as a force. The Middle Ages turned them into expendable material for the betting pool. No honor, no tactics, only dirt and blood. The dog ceased to be a comrade in arms. It became a slave gladiator whose life was worth exactly as much as was bet on it. It was in these dark ages that the terrible stereotype took hold. A big dog is evil. Peasants crossed themselves at the sight of a black dog, considering it the embodiment of the devil. Legends of ghostly hounds, of the Hound of the Baskervilles, all these are echoes of genetic memory about Roman monsters. People feared what they themselves had created. They backed the beast into a corner, embittered it with chains and beatings, and then called it a monster. Hypocrisy reached its apogee. We created hell for animals, and then accused them of becoming demons. The blood of Molossians spread through the veins of dozens of breeds. It is in boxers, in Great Danes, in bull mastiffs. In each of them sleeps a particle of that ancient legionary who was once clad in armor. But in the Middle Ages, this sleep was fitful. The dog became a hostage of human cruelty, an instrument of the basest passions. And even when the era of knights passed, when castles turned into ruins, this job didn't end. It just mutated. The new world loomed on the horizon, and there, across the ocean, old Roman methods were to undergo a terrible renaissance. Conquistadors carried not only the cross and muskets on their ships. In the holds, in darkness and stuffiness, dogs snarled. They sailed to meet new victims to prove empires change, but methods of terror remain unchanged. The murder code was ready for export to another continent. The ocean doesn't wash away sins, it preserves them. When the wooden caravels of the Spanish crown cut through the waves of the Atlantic, in their holds, in the stifling, fetid darkness, rode something more terrible than gunpowder and smallpox. The Roman code rode there. Conquistadors, those ruthless adventurers of the New World, brought with them direct heirs of imperial Molossians, Alanos, and Mastiffs. History made a giant loop in time and space to return the biological weapon to the front line. Only now the scenery changed. Instead of the misty forests of Germany and the dry steppes of Parthia, the humid green jungles of the Americas. And instead of ironclad legionaries, bearded men in steel cuirasses obsessed with gold. But the essence of the beast remained unchanged. It was still an instrument of genocide. The Indians, seeing these creatures for the first time, did not consider them animals. For them, knowing only tiny local dogs, Spanish dogs were demons, monsters escaped from the underworld. The Spaniards cynically exploited this mystical horror. They shackled their dogs in quilted cotton armor, escapils, which protected against Indian arrows and obsidian swords no worse than Roman steel. And again, as thousands of years ago, the psychological effect preceded the physical one. The roar of a mastiff echoing under the canopy of a tropical forest forced entire villages to drop their weapons and run. Because death from a bullet is an instant, death from fangs is a primal nightmare stretched in time. The chronicles of the conquest are littered with the names of four-legged executioners. The most famous of them is Becerrillo. This isn't just a nickname, it is a brand of death of the 16th century. This red-coated dog covered in scars was so effective that he received the salary of a crossbowman, a full share of loot and gold. Think about the degree of insanity. A dog earned more than a professional soldier. The Spaniards wrote that 10 such dogs were worth hundreds of men. This wasn't a metaphor. It was the accounting of conquest. Becerrillo could distinguish a peaceful Indian from a hostile one by the smell of adrenaline. He could tear off a prisoner's arm with a slight nod from his master. This was the Roman school of training, passed through centuries and reaching its bloody apogee in the tropics. Even a special term appeared, aperrir, to throw to the dogs. This became an official form of execution. Rebellious chiefs, rioters, or simply those who couldn't bring enough gold were herded into pens and the pack was released. It was the Roman damnatio ad bestias, but without spectators and stands, in the mud and dampness of the jungle. Priests accompanying the expeditions shamefully averted their eyes, calling it God's punishment. But in reality, it was pure, distilled terrorism. Living flesh was used to break the will of an entire continent. And it worked. The empires of the Incas and Aztecs collapsed not only from steel and disease, but also from the fear of jaws that knew no mercy. Centuries passed. Jungles gave way to concrete and glass of metropolises. We fly into space, carry access to all the world's knowledge in our pockets, and discuss humanism. But look closely at the modern police chronicle. See that lean dog in a harness with K9 written on it. That is a Belgian Malinois, or a German Shepherd. Outwardly, they differ from Roman Molossians. They are lighter, faster, more ergonomic. But inside, in the plexus of neurons and instincts, lives the same demon. We changed heavy armor for Kevlar vests. We replaced spiked collars with radio-controlled shock collars and GoPro cameras on their backs. But the function remained the same. A police dog is a guided missile with heat-seeking. When SWAT storms a building, the dog goes into the dark first. Why? To take fire, to find and neutralize. We call it apprehension, but let's be honest, it is a predator's attack. The dog flying into the room doesn't think about human rights. It thinks about the takedown. Its jaws clamping on a criminal's arm with pressure of tens of atmospheres are a direct greeting from antiquity. The efficiency of this bioweapon in the 21st century is just as high as under Julius Caesar. A man with a gun can miss. A man can hesitate. A dog working on prey drive doesn't miss and doesn't doubt. It is the ideal executor of the state's will, devoid of moral torment. And there is another side, the shadow side. If the police are the heirs of the legions, then underground dogfights are the rotten legacy of medieval pits. In basements of abandoned industrial zones, in garages on the outskirts of cities, away from the eyes of the law. The Roman ferocitas code is cultivated in its ugliest form. Pit bulls, staffies, descendants of those very baiting dogs, their owners call it gameness. Game. The readiness to fight even when no strength remains, even when legs are broken and blood gushes from wounds. There are no tactics here, no military necessity. There is only money and sadism. People stand around a makeshift ring, clutching bills in sweaty palms, and scream, watching two living beings kill each other. This is a mirror of our civilization. We condemned gladiatorial fights, we banned public executions, but we drove this thirst for blood underground. We continue to produce monsters. We continue to select for aggression, calling it sporting qualities. The dog in the pit is not to blame. It does what man created it for. It executes a program written 1,000 years ago and carefully preserved by us for our own entertainment. The paradox of modernity is that we live in a dual reality. By day, we kiss our Labradors on wet noses and buy them orthopedic beds. And by night, in another part of the city, a beast is let off the chain, whose only task is to tear. Or we send an assault team with a dog trained to attack the groin. We hypocritically divided dogs into friends and tools, refusing to admit that they have one root. In every poodle, in every spaniel, somewhere very deep, a wolf sleeps. But in service and fighting breeds, we didn't put this wolf to sleep. We pumped him with steroids, taught him close combat tactics, and issued a license for violence. History has come full circle. From Roman arenas to the jungles of the New World and back to the concrete jungles of our cities. Methods of delivering death have become more technological. We learned to treat wounds with antibiotics. We learned to control dogs with electronics. But the very essence of the contract between man and beast hasn't changed one iota. We feed them, and they give us their rage in return. We delegate to them that part of cruelty which we are afraid or unwilling to commit with our own hands. Besirio didn't die. He just changed his name and put on a tactical harness. And as long as humanity needs violence to assert power, this fanged ghost will walk beside us, breathing at our knee, ready at the first command to turn a civilized dialogue into a bloodbath. But the most terrible discovery awaits us not in the history of wars, but in our own home. In the mirror we are afraid to look into. Because the true source of this age-old aggression holds the leash, not wears the collar. Look at him now. Right now. He is lying on the rug in your living room, this fluffy bundle of warmth. Maybe he is wearing a ridiculous knitted sweater with reindeer that you bought at a Christmas sale. Maybe he is sniffling funnily in his sleep, or chewing on a rubber chicken that makes a squeak. You look at him and see a good boy, a family member, a nanny for your children. You are sure that between this cute creature and those armored monsters that tore throats in the forests of Germany 2,000 years ago lies an insurmountable abyss of evolution. You think that civilization has etched out the beast, dissolved it in affection and premium dry food. You are wrong. This is the most dangerous illusion modern man lives in. We didn't destroy the monster. We just taught him to pretend. We put a clown mask on him, but beneath that mask, the same Roman Molossian still bears his teeth. Genetics is not a rough draft that can be erased with an eraser. It is granite. The ferocitas code, ferocity that imperial engineers wrote into DNA for centuries, hasn't gone anywhere. It just went into sleep mode. It slumbers in every Rottweiler, in every Mastiff, in every cane corso peacefully walking in the park on a retractable leash. It is a time bomb sewn into biology, and the ticking of this mechanism is drowned out only by our self-deception. Come closer. Look at the anatomy of your pet. Cast aside sentimentality and turn on the cold gaze of an anatomist. Do you see those cheekbones? They are created not to chew soft kibble. These are levers designed to create monstrous pressure. Do you see how he reacts to a thrown ball? This isn't a game, it is a rehearsal. In the moment of the chase, the same neural circuits light up in his brain as in his ancestor chasing a runaway slave. The dopamine he gets from catching the toy is a chemical reward for a successful hunt. We call it fetch. Nature calls it murder. Sometimes the mask slips, for a fraction of a second. You've probably noticed it. A sudden sharp sound, a strange smell, an incomprehensible movement of a hand. And suddenly, your dog's eyes change. Pupils dilate, swallowing the iris. The fur on the scruff stands on end, forming that ancient ridge. Not a bark, but a low, guttural rumble erupts from the throat, vibrating the floor. In this moment, the good boy disappears. A Roman legionary stands before you. In this moment, there is no friendship between you. There is only biological calculation. Who is stronger? Who is the alpha? Who is the victim? Usually, this delusion passes as quickly as it appeared. The dog shakes it off, wags his tail, and you exhale with relief, writing it all off as nerves. But that moment of truth was real. The ghost of Rome peeked out. We brought these beasts into our homes, put them in our beds, trusted them with what is most dear. We believe that love can rewrite instincts. But love is a human invention, and instinct is a law of nature. The Romans were more honest than us. They knew they held death on a leash and treated it with respect and caution, like a loaded weapon. We handle a grenade like a Christmas ornament. We forgot the safety rules written in the blood of legions. And when a tragedy happens, when a family pet suddenly maims a child or attacks a passerby, we go into shock. We scream, "He never did that! He's not like that!" No, he is exactly like that. He always was like that. You just refused to see it. But let's be honest to the end. If a dog is a loaded weapon, then who pulled the trigger? Who created this mechanism? Not nature. A wolf kills for food. He doesn't kill for pleasure or war. It is us, humanity. We took the perfect predator and broke him. We spent centuries selecting for madness. We culled the kind and kept the vicious. We cultivated paranoia, aggression, the ability to kill without reason. We, humans, turned loyalty into fanaticism and strength into violence. A dog is clay. And we are the mad sculptor who molded demons from this clay in our own image and likeness. The Roman Molossian is our mirror. Peer into his furious grin captured on ancient bas-reliefs. What do you see there? Bestial cruelty? No. You see human ambition. You see our thirst for power, our desire to dominate all living things, our desire to inflict pain with other hands. We projected our darkest vices onto dogs, amplifying them hundreds of times. We taught them to hate. We taught them to fight. And now we fear them, lock them in aviaries, put muzzles on them, and put them to sleep if they learned our lessons too well. The history of the war dog is not a story about animals. It is a story about us.
about how an empire turns everything it touches into a tool, about how civilization is built on bones and blood, even if they are the bones of our best friends. We betrayed this union. We signed a contract with the wolf at the primeval campfire, promising him partnership, and in the end made him a slave, a gladiator, and a human shield. And this sin lies on us as an eternal burden. So who is the real beast here? The one who bites, obeying instinct and command? Or the one who gives that command? The one who knows no morality? Or the one who invented morality but steps over it for efficiency, gold, and spectacles? Look at your dog one more time. Right now, he is sleeping. The ancient ferocitas code slumbers in his genes like a coiled spring. But the next time you look into those devoted, deep eyes, remember, you are looking into the abyss that your ancestors dug. And this abyss is looking back at you. Rome didn't fall. It just changed a toga for a business suit and a sword for a leash. And until we acknowledge the beast inside ourselves, we are doomed to fear the beast walking beside our leg.